Because all you of Earth are idiots.
Punk rock accidentally created half of the heavy music you listen to today. Thrash metal, sleaze metal, rap metal. Entire scenes that defined the 80s and 90s didn't just come from out of nowhere. They grew out of something much smaller, louder, and a lot more chaotic. A handful of bands in the late 70s and early 80s basically rewired heavy music. They changed the speed, they changed the attitude, and they completely changed what rock bands thought they were allowed to do. And the crazy part is, most of them probably had no idea what they were starting. So here's how it all went down. It starts with the Sex Pistols. Now, the Sex Pistols didn't invent punk rock, but they absolutely perfected the attitude. The ripped clothes, the sneer, the idea that rock music wasn't supposed to be polished or professional. It was supposed to be loud, messy, and a little dangerous. They made rebellion part of the aesthetic, and that attitude didn't stay in London for long. Because by the early 80s, something strange started happening in Los Angeles. The Sunset Strip metal scene was exploding. Hairspray, leather, glam. But underneath all of that flash, there was a lot of punk influence creeping in. Take Motley Crue. Early Motley Crue wasn't just glam metal. They had the speed, the dirtiness, and the street-level chaos that came straight out of punk culture. They weren't trying to be progressive musicians. They were trying to be the most dangerous band in the world. And that's a very punk idea. But the influence gets even clearer with Guns N' Roses. Guns N' Roses loved classic rock, but their energy was pure punk. Fast tempos, aggressive stage presence, songs about the uglier side of life. They looked like a metal band, but the attitude was closer to a punk gang than a traditional rock group. Even bands like Skid Row carried that same DNA. You had the big choruses and the heavy riffs, but there was always that sense of rebellion and street attitude underneath. And that's the key thing punk contributed to heavy music. Not just speed, not just distortion, but attitude. The idea that rock music should feel dangerous again. And while the Sunset Strip was absorbing that punk influence, something even heavier was happening underground, because another punk band was quietly influencing the birth of thrash metal. If you ask a lot of thrash metal musicians what they were listening to in the early 80s, one band that comes up a lot, Misfits. The Misfits weren't just fast. They were weird. Horror, imagery, B-movie aesthetics, songs about monsters, death, and chaos. And musically, they were much faster than most rock bands at the time. That speed mattered because a bunch of young metal musicians were paying attention, including the guys in Metallica. Early Metallica openly loved the Misfits. They wore the shirts, they covered the songs, and they took a lot from that punk energy when they started pushing metal faster and faster. Thrash metal wasn't just heavy metal turned up. It was heavy metal colliding with punk speed. And you hear that collision in bands like Slayer. Slayer's early music has that same relentless pace. shorter songs, aggressive tempos, very little interest in traditional rock structures. That influence from punk made thrash metal feel completely different from metal. And then there's Danzig. When Glenn Danzig moved beyond the Misfits, he took that horror aesthetic and blended it with heavier, darker metal sounds, which helped push the whole style even further into heavier territory. So when people talk about the origins of thrash metal, they usually mention the new wave of British heavy metal, bands like Iron Maiden or Judas Priest. But there's another ingredient in the mix: punk. Fast, raw, unpolished. Without that influence, thrash metal probably sounds very different. But punk didn't just reshape metal. It also helped create something entirely different. Something that would eventually collide with hip-hop.
A wise hit the rock.
By the early 80s, punk had evolved again. It got faster, harder, more aggressive. This new style became known as hardcore punk, and one of the most important bands in that scene was Bad Brains. Bad Brains were different from almost every other punk band at the time. They were insanely tight musicians. Their songs were incredibly fast, and their live shows had a reputation for being completely explosive. They took punk speed and pushed it to another level. And bands all over the United States started following that blueprint. Those bands included Suicidal Tendencies. ST began as a hardcore punk band, but they started mixing in heavier metal riffs. That combination became known as crossover thrash. Punk energy. Metal guitars. It was a bridge between two worlds. And that bridge eventually led to bands like Rage Against the Machine. Rage Against the Machine took heavy guitar riffs, hardcore attitude, and fused them with hip-hop style vocals and rhythms. It was political, aggressive, and unlike anything else happening in rock music at the time. Meanwhile, hip-hop artists were also starting to cross into heavy music territory. Groups like Cypress Hill began collaborating with rock and metal artists, bringing rap and heavy guitar audiences together. And suddenly you had an entirely new genre forming: rap metal. All of it built on the same foundation that punk helped create decades earlier: speed, energy, and a willingness to break every rule.
The Shaolin and the Wu-Tang could be dangerous. Because all you of Earth are
You
idiots.
just hold on, Buster.
No, you
So-
hold on.
When people think about punk rock, they usually picture small clubs, DIY bands, 3 chords, and a lot of noise. But the ripple effect of that scene was enormous. Punk didn't just stay punk. It leaked into metal, into hip-hop, into hard rock. It shaped entire genres: thrash metal, sleaze metal, rap metal. All of them carrying a little bit of punk DNA, which means a lot of the heavy music we listen to today, it exists because a few loud bands decided to ignore the rules. And once that door opened, rock music was never the same again.